When the fossil fuel divestment movement first began on college campuses, the goal was to create a stigma around the fossil fuel industry and the disproportionate power it wields on our democracy to keep our country and our world chained to fossil fuels. The industry has been sowing climate denial for decades, while billionaires that run the companies, like former Exxon CEO Rex Tillerson, reap the profits and now run our country. But we know what the science and our own experiences as New Yorkers tells us. Climate change is real, it's happening now. Millions of people around the world are suffering because of it, and we must do everything in our power to fight the industry's climate denial. The grassroots divest invest movement has blossomed into a mainstream financial movement that is capable of moving entire economies. And that's why we not only call for divestment, but we're calling for investment to build our communities to be just, equitable, resilient, and to create jobs and to save the planet. The Divest Invest movement has spread around the world to include institutions of all sectors, from foundations and faith, to hospitals and health systems, to cities, states, and national institutions, and to individuals. And we're not just talking about the ultra-famous individuals like Leonardo DiCaprio, but we're also talking about the individuals who are able to use their own power to influence their institutions, as well as do things like close their bank accounts with big banks that are financing fossil fuel infrastructure and the destruction of indigenous lands and rights. Many of New York's institutions have committed to divest and stepped up to this call to action as a result of people power. In Cooperstown, New York, the unanimous commitment to fully divest the pension fund there was brought forward by a mobile executive, vice president, and trustee of the Cooperstown's pension board. At Columbia University and Barnard College, sustained student-led campaigns to call on the university and the college to stand up for climate justice has led Columbia to commit to divest from thermal coal and Barnard to divest from climate deniers, where the administration of the Barnard College is working with students to define the terms of what that actually means. And most recently, the historic Riverside Church on the Upper West Side, founded by the Rockefeller family, which has integrated racial, economic, social, and environmental justice into its mission, announced that it will not only divest from the top 200 fossil fuel companies, but will also work to green its 85-year-old Gothic cathedral and grounds. New Yorkers have felt the impacts of climate change. Superstorm Sandy destroyed many of our homes, businesses, and communities. Many have yet to fully recover, but New Yorkers are resilient. And we know we need to move past fossil fuels and build for the future now. As major oil companies struggle to break even, these financial institutions and businesses represented here will play a key role in a responsible transition away from fossil fuels to a new sustainable economy built for all. Businesses are betting on climate action and calling on the New York pension funds to join them to divest from the past and invest in the future. We were very fortunate to have with us business leaders of the Divest Invest movement to talk about why they've chosen to act on climate, to divest from fossil fuels where they can, and to invest in climate solutions. They're going to talk about how they've been able to do that and why they think the New York State and City pension funds should do the same. I'd like to begin by introducing a video from May Booby, the executive director of 350.org. May was originally supposed to be on our panel today, but was called to Washington, D.C. at the last minute. So if you bear with me for just a second, I will cue up her video that she prepared for us yesterday.
Hi everybody, really sorry I couldn't be with you on the panel. I'm in Washington, D.C., or about to be there. But look, I just want to say one thing. The focus of my remarks at the event was going to be about here, New York City and New York State, where we call home. And we've been pushing for comptrollers, Stringer and DiNapoli, to divest the pension funds of New York City and New York State for years now. And there's only more evidence all the time of why they should do it. But we're taking this week during a global mobilization on divestment taking place in 46 countries around the world to really amp up our call. there's a choice for them to stand on the side of the fossil fuel billionaires who are increasingly running the US government, or to stand with us and towards climate solutions and to really bring New York's leadership on climate to a new level. So we hope that they will do that. We hope this event is great encouragement for them to be part of that movement. And thank you very much for coming and for your attention.
Great. So I just want to introduce that video of May because 350 has really been one of the core organizations driving the fossil fuel divestment movement and talking about why we need to invest and reinvest in our communities for not only for jobs but also for justice. And so with that, I'm going to introduce our panel who's here with us today and able to answer some questions for us. First, we've got Matt Patsky. Matt is the CEO and a portfolio manager leading Trillium Asset Management's Sustainable Opportunity Strategy. He actually joined the Trillium team in 2009 with 3 decades of experience in investment research and investment management, and has been a leader in the environmental, social, and governance investing field for most of his career. Prior to joining Trillium, Matt was at Winslow Management Company in Boston. And a fun fact that I learned about Trillium while I was talking to Matt on the phone last week was that Trillium has actually been offering fossil-free investment options since 1982. So definitely a leader among its peers. Matt, can you talk to us a little bit about how the divestment movement has shifted the finance market, and what role do you think institutional investors play in building a sustainable economy?
Sure. Yeah, and as you thank you, and as you mentioned, Trillium started offering options for clients to be divested from fossil fuels in 1982. I give you that history. It was an option. What the firm in '82 decided that environmental, social, and governance factors were relevant to the sustainability of business models, and they incorporated those factors into the investment process. From that approach, had avoided coal and had avoided any of the most egregious environmental players in the traditional energy industry, starting in its founding in '82. The objective was to look to reinvest in companies that had positive environmental impact, and so there was overinvestment in areas of like renewable energy and energy efficiency to compensate for the lack of traditional energy exposure in those strategies. I will say the 350.org call for divestment caught us a little bit flat-footed. We used to just offer this as an option for people, and I will also say Trillium historically had done no external marketing. So clients who came to us who were usually asking for fossil fuel-free were environmental endowments, the likes of, that you would know of Woods Hole or Sierra Club, that are clients, and a lot of family offices for whom environmental protection was one of their primary objectives. So, but we in seeing the 350.org call, did start putting out materials pointing out that we've been doing it since 1982, showing the track record. Just important information, I think, for the institutional marketplace as they look at this and they debate it. Lots and lots of misinformation, particularly being produced, or I should say sponsored by the Independent Petroleum Association, that you're seeing out of academic institutions, the University of Chicago, and another, a handful of other groups that are universities that have put out studies. You'll see that it is, they are clear in saying that it's sponsored by the Independent Petroleum Association, which should make one suspect. But it still ends up coming back that I see it repeated, the facts from those studies, from almost every debate we've seen on a municipal and state pension plan. You will end up seeing legislators quoting from those studies on why it is we cannot look at divestment from fossil fuels. Just some facts from 35 years of history. There is no evidence of it increasing volatility, and there is no evidence of any sacrifice in return. Period. End of story. The storyline of why it's going to be so expensive and why it would cost in return is mostly from facts that are using old data or using ridiculous assumptions about the cost of managing the money a different way. And I'm going to give you just a couple of those facts, and I'll wrap up now, but they are using trading statistics that are 25 years old on the cost of trading securities. And so you'll look in and you'll dig in and see the footnotes, and you'll see quotes and references to trading costs that are 25 years old. For those of you who are in the industry, there's been some pressure on the trading costs. We used to be able to charge in the industry, and I'm no longer in the sell side, but in the brokerage industry used to charge a lot more for trading than they do now. There actually are no margins in trading anymore. You charge fractions of a cent, right, for trading. And so the fact that trading costs are almost non-existent is one of the reasons why that information they're presenting is completely false. They know it, but it's still there, and it's still being used as an argument against us in every, like I said, in every argument I've heard. And the other statistic I keep hearing over and over again is it costs too much, ultimately, for the manager to continue to manage without fossil fuel. And I'm like, so the argument there is State Street or BlackRock, which are willing to do an index fund for 3 basis points, would charge me at least 100 basis points if I told them to take out fossil fuels, right? Now that's from people who've never spoken to State Street or BlackRock, because they're willing to do it for 3 basis points. If you give them an exclusion list and tell them you want otherwise to be indexed to the market, they will do it for the same price. So, we know that people have done it. That's why we know it's just sort of bad information. But I just point that out as for those of us who are activists and having these discussions with our state legislators, make sure that they know the facts, make sure that we're holding their feet to the fire when they come to the excuses for not doing it. And I'll leave it there for now, but there's a lot more that's going on that certainly relates to the behavior of the oil and gas industry behind the scenes that we need to be vigilant about as this discussion goes, particularly in New York State's pension plan. There's going to be you're going to see. I'm pleased to see that the initial bill is calling for full divestment, but we've seen that backed. We've seen people back down from that every time, and I can sort of get into the reasons why later.
Good. Thanks. Next up, we've got Ivan Frishberg, who's the first vice president of sustainability banking at Amalgamated Bank. After many years of working in the climate and clean energy advocacy community, Ivan now leads sustainable banking at the bank, which is one of the premier banks for the progressive community, providing financial services to environmental, labor, justice, and political organizations and philanthropies across the community. Ivan has worked with his colleagues at the bank to really stake out a leadership role in the banking world when it comes to divesting from climate risk and serving as a role model for what a progressive and justice-focused bank could be. Ivan, so Amalgamated Bank last year became the first U.S. bank to commit to divesting from fossil fuels and other types of climate risk. How has Amalgamated Bank's divestment action and climate risk policy impacted the banking community? And what do you hope that it will achieve?
Well, 2 very different questions. I think we're at the beginning of seeing where the impact is. But first of all, I want to point out, by virtue of your last comment, and my colleague Charlie Wright is actually from our investment management team, exactly what you're describing. People say BlackRock and State Street can't do.
Right.
I'm sure they can do. We do it. We know those funds. You benchmark them against the Russell 3000, and they beat it, right? And so there's just no good financial case at this point for saying you can't do this. Having said that, our approach to climate risk is a little bit different than simply, or not just simply, but than the kind of the history of divestment and the idea of sort of focusing on energy companies and investment into those companies and what that return is. That's one obviously critical piece of the divestment thing. When we looked at sort of our role as a bank in the climate work, we very actively decided to take a sort of a different or broader view of climate risk. And so, along with going net zero as a bank and 100% renewable energy, we decided to divest all of our assets and look at climate risk, thinking about it more like the average person would. If you're a person and you're thinking about what the impacts of climate are, they're on your home or where you live, they're on your place of employment or the small business that you operate. They are much more, they're kind of tangible things that come about from the physical impacts of climate change, from how the market is changing around you. And it doesn't matter if you're an energy company thinks about the risk of stranded assets very differently than I think most of us experience that risk. But as a bank with clients, in affordable housing and small businesses, as individuals, we kind of, I think, reflect the kind of risks that those people face with climate change. And so we wanted to apply the sort of climate risk test to the finance work that we were doing, which is principally where our own assets are. So when you walk into our bank or any bank and you put that money in your deposit, it doesn't just sit there. The bank goes and takes good use of that money and lends it back out. You can go and lend it to the Dakota Access Pipeline and Energy Transfer Partners, or you can lend it to affordable housing or to a B Corp business. And so one of those things helps your community. One of those things is going to help mitigate climate risk long term. The other set of choices are going to totally screw us. So that, I think, is, to your question, that's the choice that all banks have to play in this, or to face in this, which is, are they going to be part of financing the kind of long-term construction of fossil fuel infrastructure, investments that will last a generation, that will clearly blow up the carbon budget, or are they going to invest back, restrict themselves away from those investments and focus more, as I think more regional, smaller community banks do, in their local communities. The risk associated with not doing that is really the kind of global risk that impacts us all. I think Wells Fargo, you called them out, they could keep investing in this fossil fuel infrastructure and they could find their way out of it. It's 2% of their portfolio. So I don't think it's a huge financial risk across their business model to keep doing this. There are specific risks that they'll have to navigate. The risk is to us globally. If the economy tanks, if Miami goes underwater, if all these bad things happen, it's going to be difficult to be anybody in this society, including a bank. If the economy collapses, that's not good for any bank, including Wells Fargo. So I think the risks are more global and more traditional to the climate conversation when we think about these sort of stranded assets. And so our hope is that not only the positions that we've taken are not only good for the world, they're good for our clients, but they're also they're good for the long term of all business and all of our work here. And that really we hope that others in the kind of the larger banking community, and I think we have a short window to accomplish this, will ultimately take the same view. And that Wells and Bank of America and Citibank and the folks who like to green themselves up and tell a good story about the positive work they are doing will also kind of face up to the fact that they can't keep investing hundreds and hundreds of billions of dollars into fossil fuel infrastructure and think that that's going to be good for the long term of anybody's business.
Thanks, Ivan. Next up, we've got David Levine, who's the director of the American Sustainable Business Council. David is the co-founder and CEO of a growing coalition of business organizations and businesses, collectively representing over 250,000 businesses committed to advancing market shifts and policies that support a vibrant, just, and sustainable economy. David has worked as a social entrepreneur for over 30 years, focusing on the development of whole system solutions for a more sustainable society through building strategic partnerships and broad stakeholder initiatives. These are definitely things that we need in our movement. So David, we clearly need bold climate action at every level and from every sector. And as the Trump administration and his cabinet of climate deniers continue to roll back decades of environmental policy that have helped to keep the industry in check, how have you been working with businesses in New York to push towards climate solutions?
Well, I think first and foremost, it's important to note that businesses across all sectors have really understood the kind of threat to their business and to the economy, and that's really crucial. So when we look at businesses stepping up to take action, this is not just businesses in the renewable sector, in wind and solar and the like, that we know, whose businesses will grow, and that will be a good thing for the economy. There's more jobs, there's more opportunity, but this is businesses across all geographies, across all sectors, right? So first and foremost, they're understanding the impact on them. A survey that the American Sustainable Business Council did a few years ago now, about 3 years ago, showed already that 1 in 5 businesses have already noted they've been impacted by climate change. The number is surely up by now if we were to go back. But what's key about that is that this had nothing to do with whether or not they're Democratic or Republican. The survey was not our members. It was small business owners, and 50% actually were Republican or Republican leaning. 37% were Democratic and the rest independent. So it's noted that climate change impact on business knows no political boundaries, right? This is not about the politics, it's not about the rhetoric coming from Washington. So what we've understood is that, for all too long, whether it's the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, dominated by the fossil fuel industry, or other of the trade associations in particular, right, that they've dominated the conversations in Washington. They have historically. The dominance they have through lobbying and their corporate donations and the like, influence on Congress, on the White House, right, on state legislatures and the like. So businesses have really understood that it was important, values-based businesses that were operating for the long term, that understood that the short term, at all cost economic philosophy was detrimental to their business and to their communities, have now been able to understand that it's time, not only for them to do the right thing within their business, but to actually engage in the political process. And that's what we've seen taking place. So just on Monday, our New York State affiliate, the New York State Sustainable Business Council, was up in Albany, working on a number of issues, but also in particular on the Fossil Fuel Divestment Act. They had business leaders, again, across all sectors from throughout the state saying, we're being impacted by this, by climate change, and what we want is the state to take action. In that same poll that we had done, small business owners said 60% of them plus had said that they wanted government to step up and put forward regulations, to put forward policies that would address the harm being caused by climate change. So this is another one of the false statements out there, is that businesses hate regulations, they hate they hate anything that government would do. Actually, small business owners, medium-sized, and now even large businesses, right, are all saying it's important for government to take action. How do we know this? Over 1,000 business leaders have now signed on to a letter that the American Sustainable Business Council, groups like Ceres and BICEP, and other business organizations have put forward. Over 1,000 businesses stay signed on to the Paris Accord. We had over 1,000 business leaders sign on to say, please stop the Keystone Pipeline. But likewise, we have all these business leaders, whether they're showing up in Albany like they did on Monday, or they're headed, we just had scores and scores of business leaders in DC on Capitol Hill talking to Republicans and Democrats, say it's time to invest in a sustainable economy. We see the opportunities there to grow the economy. We see the greater number of jobs that are created through renewables. We see the opportunities in other clean technologies. The numbers that are coming, have shown us that over $8.1 trillion in investments had been made in a range of clean technologies. So from renewables to water infrastructure, over to community investments and the like. So since 2009, $8.1 trillion. So clearly, there's a lot to be invested in, certainly when you think about renewables and the opportunity expanded, but when you take it to all the range of other sectors, from transportation to water infrastructure, over to safer chemicals and products throughout the supply chain. There's tremendous opportunity to move forward the economy in this way. So therefore, what we need to see, if business is taking action by reducing its fossil fuel consumption, by doing energy efficiency, by committing to actually stand up for policies that support this, it's time for government to take its responsibility more seriously, and alongside other opportunities, right, other incentives, other programs like carbon tax, divestment and reinvestment is a tremendous opportunity that New York City and New York State have in order to drive the economy forward in a healthier, safer way for the future.
Thanks, David. And that actually is a great way to also lead in and introduce Mary Cleaver. So in the Divest Invest movement, we often talk about financial flows and shifting capital. So I'm really excited to introduce Mary Cleaver, the founder and CEO of Green Table, and one of the country's foremost authorities on sustainable food and local sourcing. The Green Table opened in 2003. It's a farm-to-table restaurant in Chelsea Market. If you haven't been there, I recommend it. And they're committed to seasonal cuisine. Mary also founded the Cleaver Company, a full-service event planning and catering operation in 1986. This is one of the fun facts I learned about Mary last week, was that she was actually named the first ever snail blazer by Slow Food NYC to honor her contributions to creating a better, healthier food system for all. And I think Mary's remarks today are really going to be a great example of how businesses and all of us are really being impacted by climate change. So Mary, could you talk a little bit about how climate change has impacted your business and how you're thinking about and building climate solutions?
Yeah. The food industry, really, when you start in the field and get to the fork, is about a $750 billion industry. And our current system of industrial agriculture that kind of rules our food system now is extremely destructive and is largely responsible for climate change through use of chemicals and misuse of animal welfare and raising animals improperly. So there's a tremendous amount that needs to change. We need to actually go back to the small family diversified farm and support our regional farm and food economy in order to create better farming practices which will preserve our environment. Some of the ways that climate change is currently affecting our agricultural system have a lot to do with storms and radical temperature swings. The entire stone fruit crop in the Hudson Valley in the 2016 season was terribly affected by very, very warm temperatures in April and then very, very long, sustained, very cold temperatures following that, so that all the fruit was killed. The superstorms are also extremely destructive to our agricultural practices because, for example, the flooding that happens in the fields due to Irene and Superstorm Sandy were both terribly destructive to our region here. The work of the industrial agricultural system is destroying our topsoil at a rate, just a rapid rate. So we've lost 50% of our topsoil in the past 50, 60 years, and it's really not renewable except in an ice age. So we're not headed that way. That kind of destruction of chemicals on the land destroys the soil, runs it down the rivers, creates dead zones in the ocean, and the oceans are rising due to climate change, and that is destroying the migration of fish populations, for example, and there's just a tremendous amount of havoc being wreaked on our natural resources due to climate change that is caused by improper farming.
Thanks. So we're here today to talk about the pension funds in New York City and New York State. So I'm going to ask you, I have a couple of questions for you all, to talk about our city and our state, for folks who might live outside the 5 boroughs. So presumably, we all agree here that the city and the state pension funds should divest. What do you think are some of the biggest risks that they face from holding on to fossil fuels? And that can be for whoever wants to go answer first.
Well, just obviously the stranded asset argument been made, and I think people are well aware of it. And I think one of the things to point out, there seems to be acknowledgement broadly of the stranded asset risks with thermal coal. And so one of the things we have to be recognize is that retreating to, I'm going to divest from an industry that's already collapsed, that's already almost gone bankrupt, all the major players have gone bankrupt, is a hollow victory. We need them to be looking 20 years, 30 years forward, and to ask the question, what's next? If we're moving into an environment where we're increasingly seeing the competitiveness of the renewable energy industry, is there not likelihood that we start to see some stranded assets, particularly in higher cost oil and gas production? And that's where they have to start to focus in looking at that whole argument of stranded assets. Now, I do not believe that we end up in an environment where all oil and gas reserves are worthless. I think that's a false argument, because we know there are productive uses of oil and natural gas for more than just burning for fossil fuel, for energy. So I think we want to make sure, as we keep making the argument, that we pull back and think about where it probably ends up, which is somewhere in between. And there's still a petrochemical industry that's going to exist, and there's still going to be a plastics industry, and there's still going to be industrial production that's using natural gas. But ultimately, it is true, the supplies that have been already discovered, that have already on the books of all of these companies, cannot all be burned and will not be burned for energy production. And so if that is true, we've got a huge risk to the portfolios if they keep that same risk level in the portfolios. And so that's the main argument we make when people are to all of our clients and to when we're presenting to municipal and state pension plans.
I guess I'm not a financial analyst or advisor or market expert, but I would say, relative to your point about the supply chain, if you're looking at you have investments across a range, and some of those investments are hurting the other investments, right? So what the oil companies are doing is messing with the supply chains of a lot of other global corporate players that you're invested in, and you could talk about, the sustainability of those efforts. So there are a lot of companies that are figuring out how to be more sustainable, right? Because they feel like over the long term that delivers a better return to their investors and shareholders. So if you're holding all of this stuff, you're doing yourself harm when you kind of say, I'm going to sit here and hang on to these guys that are doing bad stuff in the other investments. I think the other piece is that over time, if you're one of these big funds and you have a really broad portfolio of energy investments, to get out of this stuff will take time, and you have to be thoughtful about it. But the longer you leave it, the greater the risk becomes. And so I think we look at it like the companies that are resisting and that are taking their time over this stuff the risk gets greater and greater as you go forward. We are, on behalf of our clients that have, we do a lot of pension fund, multi-employer pension fund work. We're pretty active on the proxy side with shareholder engagement. So we filed shareholder resolutions with 5 companies this year, asking them to assess the feasibility of net zero in line with the Paris Climate Agreement. And here, this, to us, is an example of saying these aren't energy companies, they're like Amazon, Netflix, PayPal, CarMax, GameStop. But to say there's a regulatory change that's happening. This is part of the long term of where we know things are going. You need to be thinking about how you put yourself on a path to that. And a lot of these companies are doing great things on packaging, on other sorts of waste reduction, but introducing sort of climate risk and their ability to operate in a net zero environment, which we know is where we're going to need to be. The longer you leave that, the harder it's going to get for a company, the harder it's going to be to respond. So we think, just from a shareholder perspective, it makes sense to be thinking about these things, even decades before they're going to be, you might experience real forcing action on them.
David, as you know, New York City and New York State have really staked themselves out as leaders in the climate movement. Is there a reputation on the line when they hold on to these fossil fuels in the pension funds?
Well, the opportunity is strong. Let's say from the other side of it, I think, in conversations that we've had with mayors across the country now, given the what's missing in Washington, D.C. right now, the opportunity, to step up and take the right sorts of action and become, in essence, not only a city leader, but a world leader. And we know historically, that the world, certainly the country, pays attention to what New York actually does and doesn't do, and the like. And so for them, on the one hand, to be, working as a part of the regional, greenhouse gas initiative, and at the other hand, to not move the divestment. In one hand, to try and incentivize businesses in renewables to step up, in New York State, and the other hand, to not divest and to not reinvest using the pension funds doesn't make sense. That's that in-between space. And this is not a moment in history where you sort of bet on both ponies to sort of win the race. At the end of the day, there's no racetrack anymore, right? That's what we're understanding. There's no way to play this out. So, New York has historically stepped up to take the right sorts of actions throughout time. Certainly the city has, and certainly the state has. But what they're doing is, in looking at a number of different projects, whether it's the Port Ambrose, liquid natural gas facility that the governor stopped, that our New York State Sustainable Business Council and Long Island Sustainable Business Council was involved in that issue. Whether it was putting the ban on fracking, that the governor stepped up and took bold action on. So all of these are things that say, so now's the time to move your money to the right places, to put and take the right sorts of actions that would support the kind of direction that we have been moving in, and not to hesitate anymore, because now is the moment to do that, and the world will pay attention to what happens here.
Yeah, I mean, the way you spend your money is how you change the world, especially in a capitalist society, right? So, I know the next kitchen I build, I would like to not be using natural gas because I don't know where my gas is coming from now, right? It can be fracked. I don't want to be using gas that's fracked. I'd rather be working with, we have hydroelectric power, but if I had solar power, if I had renewable energies, and chefs around the country, around the world, around the state would get behind that. And because chefs understand, or we're trying to rally all the chefs who are feeding people to understand where their food is coming from and what a difference they can make. So that's something that every small business wants to do, is to direct their dollars toward a better energy supply. So I can't speak to the massive amounts of investments as these gentlemen can, but just in terms of how a business directs its purchasing and makes a big difference.
Great, thanks. So we're in the middle of global divestment mobilization, and there are activists and campaigners around the world pushing forward on their various campaigns to get their institutions to divest. And we've certainly here in New York gotten the attention of the state comptroller DiNapoli and the city comptroller Stringer. One of the arguments that they've put forward is that their primary concern is the health of the pension funds, and that they think divestment would violate their fiduciary duty to maximize the long-term value of the fund through profitable investments. I'd like to take this opportunity today, because we have Matt on our panel, to address that issue head on. Please, Matt.
So fiduciary duty. Fiduciary duty indeed is around providing for the beneficiaries, and there's a couple things. Number one, there's a presumption in that statement that they've looked at it and concluded that it harms returns or increases volatility, neither of which is true. So I'm going to make the case that they haven't actually spent the time looking at it if they've come to that conclusion. But in addition, I'm going to just say this, and it's actually just a true fact. Almost all of our municipal and state pension plan money across this country is simply indexed to the market. That's how it's managed. And I had somebody, who I won't quote who's in the business of managing money, who said, well, no one's ever gotten fired for performing in line with the benchmark.
No.
And so the surest way to keep your job, if you are responsible for managing a pension plan for a city or a state, is to simply benchmark to the index. Because no one will ever complain that you've underperformed or overperformed. Maybe you're never going to overperform, but you're never going to underperform because you're just simply benchmarked. And so it is a sad reality that we deal with, which is, I actually had a pension plan manager say it to me this way privately. He said we would all rather be collectively wrong, right, than to risk being out there and be different. Because as long as we're all wrong together and the market moves down, we all lose together. And nobody gets fired. Nobody loses their job. And so that's the real issue going on. Now, fiduciary obligation. Fiduciary obligation to the beneficiaries. You have to explain to me how it is that you could ignore the environment into which those retirees are entering. You know, is the water they're going to be drinking clean? Is the air breathable? And how that can't be factored into if you're honoring your fiduciary obligation to the retirees of the city of New York or the state of New York. Because I don't understand how that's disconnected, right? And there's been plenty of evidence from court cases going back to, I don't know if there was the famous case of the city, there was a case against the pension plan of the New York City teachers' pension plan for having invested in New York City bonds, right? And a challenge from a retiree that was not allowed because it was below investment grade. And the ruling was, yes it is, because if the city doesn't survive, there won't be any retirement plan for any of the city teachers, right? And so thinking about it in a more holistic manner is allowed. They are allowed to read the newspaper. They are allowed to forecast 20 years out and think about what the future might look like. And they do not have to bury their heads in the sands and pretend that because they know they can't get fired by indexing to the entire market, that's why they're doing it for fiduciary duty reasons. Anyway, sorry.
Yeah, no, I mean, human beings.
That's a great answer.
We're supposed to have brains, right? We're not just lemmings.
Right, we're paying people pretty well for managing the pension plans. And I'm going to, because I know it well, the Commonwealth of Massachusetts' highest paid state employee is the individual who runs our state pension plan. He's paid as though he's managing a multi-billion-dollar asset management firm because he's managing a pool of money that's in over $60 billion. But they are indexed. 95% of the portfolio is indexed. That's it. And it's like, so maybe we should only pay them on the 5% that's actively managed.
Yeah.
Sorry.
We'll take that from the government.
Yeah.
No.
Great. That was a
Do
great
you want
response.
to take
Thank you.
questions now from the audience? Because I see someone
Yeah.
So I
raising
would
hand.
say what needs to happen for a positive change?
I don't know because I've been working on this for 35 years. So, yeah, I mean, what I'm basically trying to say is that, and this is a controversial statement, but I'm going to say it, I believe indexing is immoral. Period, end of story. I think if you simply own everything and accept that you own everything, you are taking morality out of money, and I think that's a mistake from the get-go. And so I don't understand why over half of the money in the United States is now indexed. I get that people are concerned about performance and low fees, but if that's all we care about, then we've taken any impact with money off the table and said that doesn't matter.
I'm sorry, I have a stupid question, but I don't know what you mean when you're saying index.
Oh, you're buying the index. So you put your money into the S&P 500 and you own every stock in the S&P 500, or you go to the MSC ACWI, the all world index, and you own everything. And so you go ahead and say, I am indifferent to what I own, so I'm going to own thermal coal in the same percentage it is of the global economy. And I'm not going to try to decide whether I am in an industry or not, or in a company or not. I'm just going to own everything.
And there's
right?
a way to go to every pension plan in the U.S. and determine how much of that fund is indexed?
They're all mostly disclosed where their money is. They usually are not specific to how. It's usually when you ask them for the holdings, which for most states and municipalities is a matter of public record. When you ask for it, they have to provide it. I'm most familiar with California, Washington, Oregon, and Massachusetts. We I have to confess, are very fond, actually, of the city of New York and the state of New York for doing advocacy work, a lot of great work on corporate engagement, which we join them on. And so we've never spent a lot of time looking at the state of New York or the city of New York. We've done most of our work on other municipalities or states where we've been asked to take a really in-depth look. But the data's there, and then when you go and look and you say, hey, isn't that interesting? Their coal exposure is exactly the same percentage as the index. You kind of get the, and then when they start to talk about fees, you find out that that's exactly what they've done, is taken the majority of their assets are indexed. And you find that across almost all, the state of California took it one step further in that they took it in-house, and they index themselves, and they run it themselves. And therefore, they have the ability to do nuanced changes fairly quickly without any problem, like taking thermal coal out of the portfolio, which was a tiny percentage, but they were able to do that after getting the guidance from the state legislature to restrict thermal coal. But again, I think we're a little foolish to celebrate that, because the industry was almost bankrupt before they finally divested from it.
We've got a question from the gentleman.
Yeah, I've had, like a lot of other people around, involvement in the environmental realm from different perspectives as a student in work and the like since the first Earth Day. I actually have one of those index accounts that was established last spring. And I was able, they allowed exclusions, so ExxonMobil and Shell and Sunoco and one other that's escaping me were excluded, and I get made over 9% in yes, that's for the year.
I'm sorry, you have an index product where you were able to do
They
exclusions.
allowed, I asked if I could do that.
Okay,
there
and
was a
it's
limited
called an
number.
index.
There was a, excuse me?
And it's called an index, and it's 9%
I
yield.
think it's indexed, yeah.
Okay. I'm not sure what that is, and I'd love to see it, because I've never heard of a 9% yield of an indexed product with excluding fossil fuels. But
Well,
do
anyway.
you mean
did-
it? Do you mean it?
was allowed
Do you
to
mean it went
exclude
up
that
9%?
and
Do you mean it went up 9%, not yielded 9%? Are you saying the
Yielded.
performance was 9%?
It yielded, yes.
Yielded.
Well,
But
There's
let
a
me
portfolio
get
manager
what-
behind you from that
okay,
is
Charlie,
prepared to talk
tell
about
him,
what.
this is, I think it goes to the point of, like, the fallacy of the people who say we can't do that, and
Yeah,
do they kind of default to an argument, which is to say, if you take, if there's there's like 10,000 choices for me as an investment manager, and the Russell 3000 has 3,000 of them, the S&P 500 has 500 of them. If you take away choices, somehow I've fundamentally taken away my ability to perform. It's the most abstract argument. And I think, Matt, what you're saying is basically it's an excuse for doing nothing, but just sticking to the exact recipe, as if McDonald's is the only person that ever made a burger, and you can
And you have
only
to eat
use
it.
you have to eat it, you have to do it in their proportions and their exact recipe, and that doesn't work. So we, for one client, created a fund that was based on the Russell 3000, very large, spread of companies. But we stripped out the Carbon Underground 200 companies that were contained in that. So it's not carbon free, right? Because there's still
No, it's-
carbon-based
right,
activity, but it is.
You've got an altered index, which is better than just investing in the market.
So then, Charlie, what the
and so-
returns on that relative to the benchmark index, the 3000, are?
In the February, we were up 26% for the first 12 months, and the 3 basis points growth was also 3,000.
So we are
So it's
a year,
No, you're not
6
but-
months,
but-
3 months,
right.
9 months. We're
Right.
beating the
Well, but-
market.
Basically on top of the market, and that's fine. And what the argument that's being made on the other side is it's too costly.
Right, that's the
And there's
point.
no
People
evidence
want
that that's true. And for our history, it's 35 years. We can show you there was no sacrifice in return. So when we hear it, are there periods where that'll underperform? Absolutely. Are there periods where it'll outperform? Absolutely. Guess what? It'll happen when oil is outperforming, it'll underperform, and when oil underperforms, it'll outperform. I mean, it's like common sense. It'll have more tracking error, right, to the benchmark. But it's still going to end up, over time. When you have cycles, you're going to see that there's tracking error to the benchmark. So it will not always track perfectly to the benchmark because you're missing the energy sector. So there's periods where the energy sector will outperform or underperform, where you'll get tracking error going up or down. But anyway.
Although I think that is there's enough evidence to suggest, and it's not just about the oil industry, but if you kind of go the long term, because of stranded asset risk and regulatory risk and specific things around that sector, that over the very long term, there's a cloud over that world. The other piece that we know from a proactive side is that screening for other SEG factors, right? That sustainability, environment governance. The more you can test a company by how thoughtful they are to their approach to the world, then now we kind of have really solid evidence to go, the people who think about those things and are better company managers, their companies do better.
Yep.
It's not a crazy idea, but it's very well documented now that you can apply these screens that are both better for the world, but they turn out to be better for those companies. So applying those screens to the work that you do also can help you from an investment perspective.
Yep, agreed.
Do you want to ask a question? Yeah.
Yeah, I'd like to ask Mary. Mary, could you talk a little bit about your supply lines and the relationship to, obviously to the overall subject, but talk about it in terms of its value to your business, but also how it's helped to, the relationship to the regional community of producers.
Yeah, well, when there's this notion in this country that food ought to be cheap, and
Could you speak up?
yes, sorry. There's a belief in our country that food ought to be cheap. That's what we want is cheap food. But what our industrial agriculture has created is it might be a cheap price point of processed food at the cashier in the supermarket, but the true cost of that food is tremendous in its environmental impact and on the welfare of the people in the field. I mean, our agricultural system is still based on slavery. We don't pay people who pick food. So a lot of the supply chain has to do with the people who work in agriculture or in preparing food or in serving food or all the way along the line of the food supply. if we support our regional farm and food economy, we're taking $1 and putting 10 back into our region. We cut down on fossil fuels in every step of the way, in production of the food, in processing the food, in distribution of the food, and in preparing the food. And let's all remember too that the food is going to taste a lot better if you eat it, you know, the day it was picked rather than 3 weeks after it was picked, if it's a vegetable. The supply chain, so there's a lot of economic value in supporting our regional farm and food economy and our local producers. And farming is also, you know, pastured animals are good for our environment because they are the original solar system of agriculture. So photosynthesis grows the grass, the cows eat the grass, the cows fertilize the grass, fertilize the soil, and it just all gets better. But if we're, you know, eating meat that comes from a feedlot in the Midwest that's been captured in a large group, creating tremendous amounts of methane, and a lot of chemical agriculture has gone into producing that grain that the cows don't want to eat anyway. And then it's traveling very long distances to get to the next person, and it's full of hormones that are being washed into the rivers. I mean, it's just a bad system. Did that answer your question?
So is there enough supply regionally for you to keep your restaurant going, and is there?
Oh yeah, I mean there is. I mean when we do very large events, we have to source from a little bit further away. I mean animal proteins, but and we do, you know, don't get me wrong, I love chocolate, I love citrus, you know, I drink tea, I drink coffee, those things come from far away, but we're very careful to, one can support businesses that are using the discipline of the triple bottom line, right, wherever the food is coming from. So our chocolate, you know, you want to have it bean to bar in the country of origin, so you're leaving that money in that economy as much as you can. And coffee that is fair trade and that is being raised properly, so it's not destroying the land. We don't use palm oil that's been, you know, raping the Amazon, you know.
I think Mary's example is really great, and she started to talk a little bit about the issues of environmental and economic justice. So I have a question for all of the panelists. When we're talking about investment and reinvestment, what are some of the ways that New York City and New York State can be thinking about addressing the issues of economic and environmental justice as we make this energy transition away from fossil fuels and into diversified economies?
Well, I think the opportunity, as I was saying earlier, is across all sectors. You know, first and foremost, you know, looking at addressing, you know, where we get our energy from, so the investment in renewables is an easy one to be able to look at, and that's everything from the, you know, bringing back some of the manufacturing, you know, back over to the installation, etc. You know, we've just you know, been in lots of conversations with folks at Tesla, for instance, right? So the whole drive, you know, around, they're driving, right? And the cars that 400,000 pre-orders for the next model, the less expensive model, is out there. So and where did they put their plant? One of their new plants, you know, for producing photovoltaics and like Buffalo, New York. Reinvested back in a city that's been devastated economically over the years, reinvested in a city that has a very large, you know, minority population, you know, very, very much in need of business and jobs. They put that plant there, did not take any tax subsidies, to put that there. So this idea of being able to sort of invest in the companies that will invest back in New York is there. In agriculture, just working on starting a farm, up in upstate New York, but we're getting numbers of scores and scores of new farms coming online, right? Practicing organic agriculture, supplying the local farmers markets that have grown in numbers. Gosh, it's not that long ago, in the mid-'80s, I think, when we started the first community-supported agriculture system as a part of a group that a number of us were a part of, Just Food, right? So that movement of people wanting to know where their food is coming from, who they're buying it from, right? And knowing that it's local, right? Why local matters? Well, local economies matter because we know that that money gets reinvested back in the local economy 3 to 4 times the amount as if you purchased from a big box store that might send its larger profits back to corporate headquarters somewhere. So all of these are opportunities. Reinvesting back in Main Street, period, will grow the economy no matter what the sector is. The water infrastructure opportunity, right? So from transportation to food systems to green chemistry and safer chemicals opportunities, right? We have in upstate New York, right, Ecovative, producing the mushrooms, right, that you could use as insulation, right? Business, an American business, has one thing that's been going for it for quite some time, which is the ability to innovate. And with innovation comes new and business growth. With business growth comes job creation, and potentially, when done correctly, good jobs, good paying jobs, high road business jobs, and the like. So what we're saying is, across every sector, there's the opportunity for New York State and New York City to invest in its future, and invest in businesses that will create a healthy and sustained economy for New York State and New York City.
Anyone else want to address that question? Take the other one.
I guess it's obvious, right? We have 2 missions here, and they're not always going to line up completely easily. I just spent the last couple of days with a group of community development organizations, foundations that are focused on the just transition, both in Appalachia and then out west. And they're really the communities that have been impacted by the shift away from fossil fuels, from mostly coal, both extraction and burning. Those communities are devastated. And they are trying to build a different kind of economy. I don't think that economy is going to have anything to do with what the New York State pension funds do, and neither should it, because their needs as investors and what they are trying to do probably doesn't fit with what those communities are trying to accomplish. They are much more lined up with the very local economy and building it themselves and creating equity in those communities, not equity that somebody else on Wall Street owns, but really equity that is ownership, which is based in those communities. And they are trying to create a different economic model. And so it's going to be different sources of funds that are required, and different economic structures that are required to kind of make all of that stuff work. But so it's not just as easily as switching one to the other. I think we're trying to, as we do this work and stop doing bad things that are going to kill the planet and threaten our existence, we also need to be kind of building separate or different economic systems that are just fundamentally more sustainable and they're not apples and apples in the same way.
Yes.
I had a question on reinvestment on the public equity side. So I'm wondering, it seems that because you're buying public equities on a secondary market, that investing in the good companies isn't helping them too much. So I'm wondering the most optimal strategy for public equity reinvestment, is it strategic investment in companies that can benefit from shareholder engagement, or what's the best way to have impact through reinvestment in public equities?
In the public equities, reinvestment is generally in looking at the environmental impacts that the companies you're investing in is having. And so what we try to, the presumption of I'm taking 7% out of fossil fuels and therefore 7% is going into renewables is a mistake, right? We don't want people to think about it that way. We want people to be thinking about the profile of the overall portfolio. We want to end up with risk characteristics to not look that different from the benchmark. And so we're trying to look at really reinvesting in a way in which you are looking at, yes, renewables, but broadly on just sort of energy efficiency, just broadly better run companies, right, that are more resource efficient. Your question of secondary versus primary raises in the market, the secondary market indeed does not put money into companies, but it does affect their cost of capital. And so there was a cost of capital that was shift that occurred when we had the divestment movement from South Africa. There was a cost of capital that occurred when we divested from tobacco. There was and so the theory of the campaign is that there should be the ability to exert a marginal change in cost of capital that ends up reflecting in those who have better environmental impacts, right, and the renewable energy industry having access to lower cost of capital. Has that really happened? Not really. This campaign would have to be much more successful, I think, for you to move the needle on cost of capital.
Can I answer the question by totally changing the topic and suggesting the other piece, which is, so
Sure, why not?
this thing of like how you influence corporate behavior through
Engagement.
in both engagement or the trading of equities,
Okay.
and right, so there's this fight that happens in the investor world, like divestment is bad because then you can't work with the companies to be better, and engagement is bad because it's just never going to really work quick enough, and we just can't have these people anymore, and so it's like they take their camps and they fight. And and I will say, like, we kind of do both.
We do both also.
But overall, I would say this is probably my more controversial point. It's not even the right conversation. If you're just thinking about how to change the world and change the world quickly, I don't think that this is like the whole deal. I mean, so this is where when I kind of come from the world of policy advocacy, right? And nothing about corporate behavior and the way they think about climate risk probably going to drive things quick enough to where we need to be. I mean, a report that just came out today, right? We are a decade away from hitting 1.5 or thereabouts. Right. So there's nothing from a pure climate risk perspective that's going to tell somebody that this is a more immediate risk than a trade issue that's going on, or a tax issue that's going on, or the other things that happen in business. So climate is always a further out risk. So the first thing is, if you want to impact this thing, it's policy and it's advocacy and it's organizing and it's politics and it's elections and all those things first and foremost. We do have to think about the money world. But I would then say, the banks, this is the thing that's sort of been my realization, and how we got to working together is, the last 3 years, the big banks put $785 billion into fossil fuel infrastructure. $785 billion out the door in 3 years to build things that are going to last generations of just extracting, pumping, and dumping. If they do that again, we're toast. Right?
Yep.
And so the banks, this is where we have leverage. Because I don't know about you, maybe you're like Mike Bloomberg's son or grandson, right? And you have the big equity problem that you have to figure out how to deal with. But more likely, your biggest financial relationship is with the bank that you go to, and that your money sits in there. And Wells Fargo should not be doing investment in fossil fuel infrastructure. They have big corporate problems to fix. This is 2% of their portfolio. They should be worried about home mortgages, about customer. They should be worried about like other kinds of investment, and they should be getting the hell out of fossil fuel infrastructure, because that is going to destroy everything. It's going to destroy all the mortgages that they own. I mean, so when the call starts coming in during the big crash, Christ, we have a bunch of mortgages that are underwater. The next call is going to be they're really underwater, right? And the impact is going to be even greater.
Right.
And so that's a risk. That's something we can do, and I feel like that is where we have more power as a movement is to impact bank behavior, because it's not just financial risk that can be quite far out, but it's also brand risk. These banks are now facing municipalities and businesses and customers that are saying, hell no, I'm not going to do this anymore. I think within the last couple of days, right? I think Citibank had virtually every one of its branches in one city shut down by protests. That's a real risk to some of these companies. And so I feel like that is the kind of organizing we need to do to change big bank behavior. And if we don't, then that's our first major collision with science.
Yeah, no, agreed. And the policy issue is a very real leverage point that we have to be aware of. We tend to focus on left versus right, Democrat versus Republican, and we are faced with a threat that better get us to the point where we're willing to sit with people across the aisle. They're now running Washington. And we better be willing to sit and say, how do we come up with policy, whether it's tax policy, you know, or regulation. Regulation seems to be a bad word for them. So tax policy to create a shift in the cost of capital toward fixing this and fixing it quickly, because otherwise we are in real trouble. Yeah.
It's challenging when you have climate deniers in the cabinet.
It is absolutely challenging, but but the reality is the threat is so, you know, we have such a short timeline. If we don't try to work right now with the people in Washington, despite what we think of some of them who are there, we are really going to be in trouble. We don't have the luxury of waiting to elect the next administration before we start trying to work.
And there are a number of, you know, like we just said, you know, we've been bringing up scores and scores of business leaders, and I think that's one of the key other strategies is for investors and business leaders to actually be doing this work. So it's not just citizen action, that those strategies are important, but it is really, really crucial that business leaders show up and make the business and economic case.
Right.
Because that's the argument that's been used against, right? About taking action for years on this and many other issues.
Right.
But showing up, jaws have dropped. You know, we've never heard from business leaders actually making this case before. Oh, you're in my district. That makes sense. You know, let's pay different attention. You know, we had standing room only. You know, we did an event at the Republican National Convention on climate change. Why? It was not mentioned at the convention itself, but it was standing room only, and we co-sponsored it with 7 different Republican think tanks and other organizations that are there. There are leaders that are out there on both sides of the aisle that are willing to stand up in spite of the kind of pushback that they'll get, in spite of the dollars that will get dropped in their district, you know, to lobby against those campaigns and the like, that are understanding that it's a values-based decision, that they're making an ethical and moral decision. But what we're saying is there's also a business argument to be made here, and that's what we need to make more than ever, and I think that's why it was important to do this forum today.
The farm drops are going to happen in their states.
Yeah.
So with that, I can't think of a better way to close this out today. And it's 11 o'clock, and I know a few of our speakers have to run out. But I do want to say that folks will be hanging out, so you'll have an opportunity to talk to them after we wrap up. Firstly, and I want to thank all of our panelists for this amazing and wonderful discussion. This went really great, and thank you so much for all of your remarks and addressing some of the issues with the pension funds, as well as what we all collectively really need to be doing that goes just beyond fossil fuel divestment and how we can be reinvesting. So thank you all. And I also just want to thank the Dorothy Day Center for Service and Justice, which is where we are today, and Kathy Crawford for her help. You probably saw her messing with the computer and helped get this room, so I want to give her a thank you as well. Please hang out. We still have